Welcome to HortTube. My name is Jim Putnam. This is the garden question and answer video that I do on Sundays. You can ask gardening questions down below the video in the comment section, and that's where we pick from each week. I think there's like 24 that were written down from this past week. There have been for like the last few weeks a lot of repeats of questions that had been answered recently, and so if I'm not picking something that was asked here a couple times recently, it's probably in one of the last 4 or 5 videos, because again, probably a third of the questions from this past week I had answered very recently in other question and answer videos. And so while I try to make them seasonal, I don't want to make them but so repetitive, trying not to anyway. I guess this will be the closest garden Q&A to Christmas, so I figured I'd stand in front of a palm tree for the Merry Christmas to everybody. Thank you guys for following along with the channel. Got about 2 more weeks on the $50 discount for the Learn to Garden video series and the weekly garden planner. The codes are on the screen here to get the $50 off, so maybe a last minute gift idea on one of those. The January part of the weekly garden planner will go up this next week. It's been shot at this point. Let's see, I mentioned the questions, a few duplicate questions we've had recently, and a lot of chemical questions. Boy, there were a lot of questions about like how to kill this and how to kill that. And last week I ended up talking about chemicals like 3 times, and I just don't want this to be, an ongoing thing. There are some things occasionally that you're going to have to spray to get to the starting line, and some of your, that's just the way that is. And that's what that chemistry is available for. You hope to get to a point where you're maintaining your garden organically in some way, but a lot of times to get to the starting line, and I don't want to be every single week going, the way you kill some of these things is with chemistry over and over and over again. But that is, in fact, the answer a lot of times is to get to the starting line, you have to do something that you're not comfortable doing or whatever, and then you're at the starting line. And you can get to work. Otherwise, it can take years to get things under control sometimes. Anyway, there you go. So I didn't want to pick a bunch more. There were a lot of questions. How do I get rid of this? How do I get rid of that? Kind of questions. Let's see. Make sure when you're asking questions that you're including your zone if you can, and maybe what area of the country. Sometimes that can be helpful. I do travel a lot, and so I am familiar with different areas of the country and how it's helpful sometimes to maybe answer it more specifically for your area of the country. Big difference between, again, I've mentioned last week, Zone 9 in Oregon and Zone 9 in Texas. Big differences. Let's see. I put up 2 cleanup videos this week, just trying to get this garden under control, reestablish my paths, some of the thicker areas of leaves out here, getting those mowed or chopped up or cut down, or just reducing them in size a little bit, but leaving them out here in the garden, not letting any organic matter get out of here. And then I put up a video. As you're watching this, I think on Saturday, you will see, I put together a very long video of the original planning for this garden and some more updated video. And you can skip through that if you want to, but I went through in those series of videos, laying out the garden, laying out the paths, edging, like a lot of things, how to start the garden, the wood chips that we put down, all kinds of things that were in those original videos. But it is like an hour and 20 minutes long or something like that. Let's see. And a birthday shout out to Daniel in North Arlington. I had gotten an email from your wife that your birthday is, I guess, December 26th. And so shout out to you for your birthday. A lot of times, one thing with I have to make a new email address for HortTube. I get so many emails that if you're emailing me, asking me questions and whatever else, a lot of times I just don't see them. There are so many emails that come to that account, and I don't want to hire somebody to be going through emails, but I have to have a separate account at some point for some things, and different than others, because it's just an overwhelming amount of email comes to that horttube@gmail.com address, and I just don't see a lot of them. So if I don't respond to something, don't take it personally. It would be my full-time job to respond to emails on that email address at this point. Okay, we're gonna get to some questions. Somebody asked, how do you know an evergreen is dormant? So I don't know if you're talking about like a conifer evergreen, or like a leafy evergreen like this camellia back here. But regardless, if you're not seeing any new growth on them, there is some point here where I can tell by maybe time spent in the garden where you can tell that these plants have pulled their sugars, you know, down into their roots, even the things that keep their leaves during the winter time. There's definitely a change in color for the loropetalum and for, you know, for any of the, you know, my David viburnum over here, or, you know, you can see a bit of a change in color in them when they actually pull the sugars down into the ground and stop trying to grow for a little while and just go into that it's cold outside moment for the winter time. Unfortunately, leading up to some really cold weather that we had about 3 weeks ago, we had no cold weather. So a lot of the leafy evergreens were still trying to, they weren't necessarily growing, but they weren't in the sleep mode that they needed to be in and prepared for that cold to come. So you can't see it behind here, but right behind the palm is a stellar ruby magnolia. It's got a lot of burn on the top of it where it was still had a lot of moisture up in those leaves up at the top before that cold came. But you can kind of tell when they go a little bit, they change the color a bit when they fully have gone dormant, leafy evergreens. The conifers, depending on how cold your area is, some of the conifers do a lot of their growing in the fall and in the spring and not in the heat of the summer. They go through like 2 dormancies a year, maybe the peak of winter and you know, during the summer, but they have better antifreeze, the conifers do, in them to be able to withstand and not necessarily go into a full dormancy that other things do. They'll take the opportunity to grow on during mild conditions in the fall and in the early spring. I mentioned that we buy quart-sized conifers when we can, small plants, even for shrubs. I'll buy really small plants, and we can use them in containers for a few years and then ultimately pop them into the ground here and there throughout the garden. And you can get several different versions of this plant if you buy it small and go through different things, and then you find a permanent home in the garden eventually when it gets some size on it. And this person just wanted to know where we buy those conifers. A lot of the garden centers this time of year have Isley Nursery out that we visited last year and did video content from, sends a lot of these either dwarf conifers or small container conifers to garden centers all across the country this time of year. You likely have a garden center somewhere in your area that has small conifers for Christmas time in their stores. Let's see, number 3, should I cover my daffodil or tulip foliage that is up? I will answer this one a few times over the next few weeks because it stayed so warm through the fall that a lot of people's tulips, daffodils, hyacinths, all kinds of things are up in the garden already a little bit. I don't cover mine. You could kick some leaves over top of them if you're nervous about if it's going to get really, really cold. But that foliage is likely going to get a little bit burned, that part that's sticking up above the ground. And then when they come into bloom, the tips of the leaves are going to have that browning on them, so they're not going to be pristine like they normally would. But I don't do anything, but the ground is pretty well covered here, and there's some leaves here and there that are probably covering most of the ones that are trying to stick their heads up. So if you've got some leaves, you could do that. If you don't want to put giant whole leaves on them, you can mow them, and then, like I did in the videos this week, and then add some of that material over top of them if you want to try to do something to keep that burn from happening quite as much. Okay, number 4. Will spring bulbs rot underground after it goes dormant and I water the rest of my landscape? Not typically. If you were watering enough to rot the bulbs after they go dormant in June-ish, May, June, July, depending on where you are. If you're the further north you are, the later they're going to go dormant. For us, they're pretty much well underground by the second week of June, certainly by the first week of June. Typically, there's very little signs of them anywhere in the garden. If you're watering enough after that point to rot them, then you're probably overwatering your garden, unless you have really just soil that just doesn't drain at all, you know, that just holds on to water for a long time. And that's probably not the right place to be planting your spring flowering bulbs anyway. So, you know, if it's wet enough to rot them, you're either overwatering or it is just not the right place for them to be. But typically it's not an issue at all. You know, the summertime, it's kind of hard to overwater your shrubs enough, you know, in the summer heat. to rot the bulbs. Okay, let's see. So somebody was talking about making a video on the new horticultural zone map. And there is one on the channel, and you can go back and search it, that I did with Tony Avent down at Plant Delights Nursery. I thought it was a pretty good video where we went over a lot of different things, explaining, the map and why the map exists and the shortcomings of the map overall. If you want to go back and look at that, I think the biggest issue, the map is just a starting point. So the horticultural zone map, it's just a starting point for you to think about where a plant might be hardy in your area. It's not the end all be all, but it's a pretty good starting point for if something says it's hardy in my zone, in zone 7, that if I'm in zone 7, it should be hardy in my area. So it's a starting point, but it's definitely not the end all be all, because it doesn't include heat. I talked about this last week, the difference between, a dry heat somewhere versus a humid area, that a plant might like that humidity, or it might very much dislike the humidity that you might get in Florida with the same 95-degree temperature that you might have somewhere else. So depending on where the plant's evolved, on the planet, may have some impact on humidity, heat. The amount of days in a row that you stay above 100 degrees is going to have some impact on how plants are going to survive if they didn't come from an area like that. So that's all the heat related, that you're not getting any of that from the map. The map is just saying this plant will go down to this low temperature, before it gets potentially damaged in some way. The big shortcoming with the map for me is that we've seen our average temperatures come up substantially. It was quite a bit. It was nearly 3 degrees. It was between 2.5 and 3 degrees on average that our average nighttime temperatures came up from one data set to the next data set. So it was a substantial amount of nighttime warming during that period of time, but it didn't necessarily it doesn't change your absolute low temperature that you're gonna get. So as an example of that, I'm in 7B in Raleigh here. And so we went from an average low temperature of something like 10 degrees to, when the new map comes out, now we have an average low temperature of 15, okay? And so we go from 7B to 8A. It may have gone from 15 to 20. I think it went from 10 to 15 as our average low temperature. But it did not change the fact that during that data set, we had a 0-degree night. So we still had the low temperature that we had always experienced, right? It doesn't, just because the average has come up doesn't mean that you're not still going to get nights that could damage the plants that you're planting into your garden. And so I wish, and we talked about that in that video with Tony, that they would put the temperatures on the map, that the low temperatures people actually experienced during that 15. The map is made up of two 15-year data sets, the last two 15-year data sets combined together. And so we just wish on the map it said, hey, Raleigh is zone 8A, your average low temperature is going to be 15 degrees every winter, but keep in mind that in the last 30 years, you've actually had a 0-degree night. And then that would allow people to, to adjust to their tolerance of damage that they would take in their garden. You know what I mean? So they would, you might still consider yourself zone 7 or whatever in that regard, and only plant things that are slightly more hardy than the 8A area that I'm in on the map. But anyway, there's some of the shortcomings of the map. The map, as our nighttime temperatures warm, and I expect that the next map update, whenever that is, may move a lot more people another half a zone. But it doesn't mean you're not going to still get that crazy low temperature that you get occasionally, because there's still weather, right? Okay. What is up next? So somebody has a security light on a light pole. Oh, they have, okay, so their light pole light was changed by the electric company. Now it's stronger. They probably put an LED in. It's just much brighter. Are there problems for animals and plants, with lights? So I've said this before, I think the night belongs to the night, and I would like to darken the area a bit more than our neighborhood is. We have a light right between us and the neighbor out here. It's quite bright. I don't like it. I've shown on Instagram a Japanese maple on the road that adjoins me over here that as it goes, they have a light next to their driveway that stays on 24 hours a day. And the Japanese maple, half the leaves drop off of it on one side that doesn't have the light, and the leaves stay on it on the other side weeks longer every year. So it definitely has an impact on that Japanese maple. It doesn't necessarily have an impact on all plants, but it has an impact on moths. It has an impact on insects and migration and lots of things. All this night lighting that we do obviously does have an impact, and it has an impact on some plants. Whether that shortens their lives or gets them damaged in some way, again, I've heard somebody had told me in the past that dogwoods really don't like light at night. Don't know if that's true or not. Our native dogwoods. Again, I don't actually know if that's true, but regardless, it is an upsetting of the natural cycle of day and night for sure to have this many lights in our cities. Can't do much about that. People are want security. So there you go. Let's see. That was number 6. So somebody said they've been saving their viewer photos for me to do a Sunday subscriber Sunday at some point, and I will sometime in the future. I try on these Q&As on Sunday to have this kind of be my write down the questions and go shoot the video and go put it up on YouTube quickly. And not have it be the long, a really overproduced video. The subscriber Sunday got bigger and bigger and bigger, and they're a lot to edit. When I throw out, please send me your photos for subscriber Sunday, it's a lot of emails, and every photo comes in as a different size, and so every single one of them has to be, resized. A lot of them come in formats that don't work in my editing software, so I have to open Photoshop and save that photo as anyway, it's a lot of work to produce that video, but I enjoyed it. I enjoyed it until it became the amount of hours that it became. But at some point, I'll take the opportunity and get you guys to send some photos in, because I enjoy seeing them. So it's not that I didn't enjoy it, but it just became, a lot of work over time. And, just getting folks to turn their phones sideways, to take the photos. A lot of the photos came in this way, and YouTube is a widescreen format, so just photos were all over the place. So that's the reason I haven't done it in a while. It's just the amount of work that went into it, and I don't want to hire a bunch of people to help me with this. I really kind of enjoy, Steph and I, being the HortTube team, and not having employees. I had employees for 25 years of my business, and I'm kind of happy at this point to not. So anyway, there you go. But I will at some point. And so thank you for waiting, and thank you for collecting your photos. I really enjoy seeing them for sure. So it's not it's not that. Okay, let's see. So somebody has a branch growing below the graft on their Japanese maple. So a lot of these plants, I got a grafted Japanese maple over there. I've got a grafted Tokyo Tower Chinese fringe tree over there. The red bud, the Golden Falls red bud is grafted. You'll see down at the bottom of the tree, where you can see where the top of the tree was basically attached to the bottom of the tree. I have a grafting video on the channel if you want to learn about grafting that we did with Jason Stevens. Video hasn't been watched a whole lot over time, but I think it's good information watching Jason graft a few plants. And I think that was the Tokyo Tower Kyananthus that he was grafting, if I remember correctly in that video. So if you want to learn about it, want to know about it, a lot of the plants that are in your garden are potentially grafted. Some of your conifers and some of your newer, interesting trees are grafted down at the bottom. If you have a branch growing below that graft, that branch is not the plant that's on the top that you purchased. It's the thing that the plant was grafted onto, the rootstock that it was grafted onto. So you definitely want to be cutting off anything that's growing below that rootstock pretty quickly. Anything that's growing below that graft pretty quickly, and clean those branches off, and hopefully they stop. You'll note it's on a very vigorous rootstock. Typically, you'll take your really interesting slow growing Japanese maple and you'll attach it to rootstock that's just more vigorous than it would be if you rooted that plant on its own. And so that rootstock has the potential to grow much faster than the plant that's on the top. So it will just take over the other plant if you don't cut them off. Let's see. So somebody was just asking if clean sweep snowbank would grow in the Mojave Desert. They spend about 5 months over the 100 degrees. So this is an Indian hawthorn. I don't think it's probably going to like being over 100 degrees for 5 straight months, even though it's hardy in zone 8B where you at. It's a good question, right? Because this is the same kind of, the issues with the zone map. So 8B Mojave Desert, you think of Mojave Desert would be zone 10 or something, but it gets quite cold in the desert. So, with no humidity to hold the heat in, as soon as the sun goes down, it gets cold. If you haven't lived out there, spent much time out there, desert gets quite cold. And so you're zone 8B, but then you spend 5 months over 100 degrees during the days. And so that really, you start to limit the plants that will grow in that area. Plus you have very seasonal rainfall, if hardly any rainfall during the year, depending on where you are in the Mojave Desert. It would probably not. Most of these temperate Japanese, Asian plants that are zoned, that typically you'll see zone 7 to 9 on them, like a loropetalum or, like an Indian hawthorn. There's just a lot of those. Distillium would come into that group. There's Asian azaleas. Most of those plants are hardy in like zone 7 to 9. Some will come up to zone 6 potentially, but most of them are zone 7 to 9. Most of those plants are not probably going to want to spend 5 months over 100 degrees typically. Definitely they become part shade plants if they were full sun plants somewhere else. So if you're reading a tag, and it says full sun, zone 9, zone 7 to 9, it's probably a part shade plant for you if you were going to try one. And it's not everything's been tried everywhere. A lot of times people are asking me a question. I want to know what plant will solve this problem, and they want to go buy 14 of them. You can always buy one, right, and try something for a season or two and not break the bank trying to figure out whether it's the right plant for you or not. You don't necessarily, you don't have to buy 15 of them to start with. Okay, so somebody said, when exactly is prune after flowering? Because their Allegheny viburnum seems to always be blooming, some part of process of blooming. They're either budding, flowering, or berrying. And they're in zone 6B. So the peak flower for an Allegheny viburnum is definitely going to be spring, and then they have this remontant habit. Some do and some don't, where they'll just continue to bloom on and off through the whole summer. And there's a lot of viburnum that will do this. Our viburnum obovatum do that. But the main flowering that sets those fall fruit is in the spring, and so you'd prune them after that. You would be cutting off the berries. So this is the problem with any kind of hollies are this way. Lots of plants are this way. That spring flowering is the berry set for later for the birds. And so some plants, there isn't a great time to prune them. If you prune them after flowering, which would be the main flowering for the plant, like a loropetalum, I'm saying loropetalum too many times in this video, but my loropetalum is spring flowering for sure. But then they tend to have residual flowers in the fall as well. But definitely it's a spring flowering, and I would cut it after it flowers. But if it was a fruiting plant or a berrying plant or something I was doing for the birds, if I pruned it at that time after it flowered, then I'd be cutting all those off. So the answer is there's not a great time, and you should probably, if you're planting a plant, not just for the flowers, but also to benefit the birds later in the season, you're best to put it in a space where you can allow it to just get the size that it gets. And it's probably, I have tons of plants planted in this garden that ultimately we have to size control because they're crowded together or whatever. But if it was something that I was relying on to flower and fruit, it really needs to be in its own space where it can get plenty big over time. And then what you do is you just put it on a schedule where you'd prune it every 3rd or 4th year after it flowers. So you just sacrifice the berries every 3rd or 4th year and just cut it hard when you cut it and not cut it every year. So that would be my strategy. But there are a lot of plants like that if you prune them, if you prune after flowering or the main flowering time, you're eliminating some other benefit of that plant. What are some trends we have seen from our travels around the country? Well, it's definitely more native prairie spaces, more gardening for pollinators, gardening for birds, a lot more use of native grasses. You know, it seemed like the first 30 years of my time in this business was all non-native grasses, you know, miscanthus and, you know, pampas grass and other kind of non-native grasses from elsewhere in the world that were showy in the fall, but kind of rigidly, they were grown for fall. Now you see all the grass, a lot of the grasses going in are a lot of our native grasses. And then again, that Delaware garden that we shot on the trip up north to Canada, that garden is a great example. Even the Highline in New York City is a great example of what we see out in the world. Is more of a use. It's not all native though. I mean, these gardens aren't 100% native. They're just recognizing that some percentage of the garden, you know, should be native and allow pollinators and birds and other creatures to exist in that space. Definitely, probably trending toward less overall formal. You know, less overall. I mean, you know, you see more vegetable gardens in front yards. You see more, you know, people reducing the amount of lawn that they have, or, you know, as I call it, lawn with a purpose. You know, just saying, hey, I need this lawn because I have dogs and I have young kids, but I don't necessarily need this lawn, and then eliminating some of that. So just more of, I think more of a natural look, and kind of recognizing that we can store a lot of carbon in these spaces, and then we can enjoy these gardens. I mean, you guys can hear, this is December, I don't know if you can hear it in the background, but this is December, whatever it is as I'm shooting this, 21st, maybe 20th. And all these birds are out here. I mean, I've had birds around me the whole time I've been, you know, having this conversation with the camera out here. You can hear all the birds back here, but it's all, you know, this space is, you know, I've created a great space for them to spend 12 months out of the year out here. So anyway, that's what we've seen as we've gone around the country, and it was probably time, you know, for the less formal, less rigid, you know, types of gardens, the total control, edge to edge kind of gardens that we've seen for a long, long time have kind of, you know, and there's the bird just flew right past, probably won't change everyone on that, but we just see more natural spaces. Let's call it that. Somebody said, what can be planted now? Anything that's hardy in your area that's at the same place that all the other plants are in your area, meaning that if you went and bought something at a garden center right now and it was covered in new growth, that wouldn't be a good idea to go put that in the ground. But if it's dormant and you can work the soil where you are and the soil's not too wet this time of year, you're not going to create a lot of compaction by being on the beds. If the beds are really, really wet in the winter and you go out there, you know, and stomp the soil down a lot, you're going to create more compaction and that kind of thing. That may not be a good idea. But as long as the plant looks like it should, you know, if you buy a Japanese maple and the leaves are off of it in December or January, you can put it in the ground for sure. If you buy, you know, even this palm, you know, it doesn't like wet feet. And so if I'm planting it in December, January, I know the ground could be a little more wet. But if the plant seems dormant, then, you know, and the ground is workable, I'll put it in the ground pretty much all the time. If it's very marginal in your area, if you're in zone, if the plant is hardy in zone, 7 to 9, and you're in zone 7A, that might be something I would hold off until the spring. So, but if it's well hardy and it appears that it has the same look of all the other ones that are in your area based on that time of year, shoot, I'm putting it in the ground for sure. And one more time I'll mention, because it's like 2 more weeks left on the $50 off on the Learn to Garden video series and the weekly garden planner. I mentioned last week that the 3rd video from Steph's design series is up, and there's a 4th one coming, and I'm adding a video to the Learn to Garden video series, and January is going up on the weekly garden planner this week. There you go. Somebody said, should I wrap my containers in burlap? I guess to keep them warmer during the winter time. It depends on what's in the container. Depends on how hardy you know, the thing is, it's in the container, how cold it's getting outside, it will help to insulate the container. You know, I've seen people, you know, do that. It probably would help to have some sort of styrofoam in between that burlap and that container, something that can hold some air in between the two. But for me, I would rather cover something up and lock the soil temperature into that space rather than try to wrap burlap around it. Wrapping burlap around it still leaves the whole root system up above the ground. If I throw a pretty big cover over a container and what I want to do is trap some of the ground heat in that space. And that's the way we covered things at all of our containers at the nursery. It's a better overall technique, because what you're trying to do, the ground, no matter how cold it is near you, is definitely warmer than the air temperature on the coldest nights of the winter. And so just putting some sort of cover over top of it that locks a little bit of that heat in will raise the temperature 5 to 10 degrees under that cover during the winter time. So that's what you see nurseries do. Once you get to a certain point in the country, you'll see everything go into plastic houses. But those of us in the South, typically we'll just put all our pots pot to pot, you know, just touching one another, and then throw cover over top of it. And that's usually enough for most plants. Let's see. Yeah, so somebody said you suggested covering some newly planted shrubs from the fall. How do you know which ones will be susceptible? Again, that's just, you know, again, the hardiness zone that you're in versus, I mean, this person has a banana appeal Elysium, which Florida Sunshine Elysium and banana appeal are, I almost think, mixed up in the trade, because I cannot tell the difference between the two of them to save my life. I mean, people keep pointing out what the difference is supposed to be to me, and I ask, trust me, all the time. Every time I go to a nursery and somebody's labeled them banana appeal versus Florida Sunshine, I'm like, what is the difference? And I don't know that anybody can actually say. And then I'll get somebody that will guess, well, this one has a slightly larger leaf. But then I'm seeing them in nurseries all over the place with the same small leaves or big leaves. There probably was originally some difference between them, but I think they're just mixed up in the trade. But they're similar enough. But they're in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and it's already got a little bit of damage on it. That's from, you know, having the temperature drop so fast. So if it's already got some damage on it, that's probably something I would think about covering if the temperatures are going to get abnormally low. The plant is asleep at this point though. So if you're sticking around your average low temperatures of 15 to 20, then that's not that big of a deal at this point. But if it's going to drop below that, so anything you think that has already got some damage done to it, or is not even supposed to be hardy in your zone, like you're in zone 8A, but the plant's 8B to 10 or something like that. Those are things you'd want to think about covering. It's mostly leafy evergreen things for the most part that are the most susceptible to issues before they're well established in your garden. Somebody bought hosta in the fall. They bought hosta, geraniums, ajuga, etc., planted them in September. Is it too greedy to divide them in spring? Do you recommend not dividing any perennials immediately after purchase? I'm totally greedy dividing them. So yeah, as long as you're, you know, you pull something out of the ground or pull something out of a container and look at it, and, you know, if you're in a nursery setting, you know, I'll take a hosta and turn it into 5 real quick if they're going into containers and I'm in a controlled media or soil and fertilizer and pots, and I'm controlling the watering and all that, I'll get real greedy. If you're putting something back in the ground, you probably want to get slightly less greedy. You know, maybe that hosta I cut into 5 pieces, I only cut into 2 pieces. You know, but I will absolutely pop them out of the ground after 6 months and divide them. Not an issue. But I would, again, if you're just dividing them and putting them right back into the ground, you might leave the chunks a little bigger than you would otherwise. If you want to pop them out of the ground and get super aggressive, I would do that in containers, let them fill out the containers a little bit, and then plant them back in the ground. Hope that makes sense. Your greed will be based on what you're doing with them immediately afterwards. Okay, let's see. So how did Holly get her name? She's not out here with me this morning. she was decided to stay in and chew on a Christmas present bone that she got. When I got Holly, we got her near the beginning of the year, and the rescue place that she came from had named all the dogs something to do with Christmas. And so her name was actually Holiday, and I just shortened it to Holly, and it made sense with the nursery and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, so she was kind of named after the plant, but it was a shortening of something she already had. So it's both, I guess. But her name was originally Holiday. Okay. So this person has two heavy-duty trucks have failed to pull out 32-year-old crepe myrtles. So they attached a truck and chain to them and couldn't get them out. They want to transplant an Osmanthus fragrans there. Is there an other strategy that they should use? I think so I'll cut them out with a Sawzall. Typically what I'll try to do with a stump like that is I'll try to dig out from it a bit and find some of the roots that are running out into the soil, and then take a Sawzall and actually cut them down in the ground. I think that's probably your best strategy. Once you cut a couple of those roots out from it, you can go back to the truck and find that you can pull it out a little bit easier. I had the purple smoke bush out at the street that I pulled out in a video earlier this year with my pickup truck. And initially when I snatched at it, it was not moving. And I just dug a little bit more. I found a couple of roots that I could cut, and I actually just sawed them with a handsaw. But if you can't saw them with a handsaw, you can pretty quickly do it, with a Sawzall, with a blade, and just saw down in the ground. Once I cut a couple of the roots, I was able to bend it a little bit more. Once I was able to bend it a little bit more, I was able to expose a couple more roots that I cut with a saw, and then out it came. So I think your strategy is to go back to the truck, but then try to cut a root, pull on it, cut another root, pull on it. So it's just going to require a little bit more digging, but you can get them out. But old crepe myrtles are hard to get out. I had a funny consultation a few years ago. I recommended this person remove a crepe myrtle that was way too close to their house, and I said, boy, this thing's really going to be hard to get out of the ground. And they emailed me a photo. He emailed me a photo like 2 hours later of this thing laying on the sidewalk. It was like, challenge accepted. and somehow got that one out super quick. But for the most part, they're very difficult. They're very good at rooting themselves into the ground. And then I get another question that's, Steph wrote it down as 17 and 17B. This person wants to get rid of crepe myrtles that are full of scale and sooty mold. If they cut them down, how is it best to eradicate the suckers? You got to dig them out. You can cover them you could cover it in plastic. You could spray them. I don't want back to my spraying thing. You can do all kinds of things, but you're best at the end of the day to try to get some of that stump out of the ground. With suckers from plants that have been taken out of the ground but still are suckering, I'll typically walk around with a shovel and just cut them off right below the soil. Just take the shovel and just stab at them right under the ground. And pretty quickly, I can go through a lot of suckers, just cutting them off that way with a sharp shovel, just right under the ground. But they're going to come back, but they come back less vigorously each time. The main thing with suckers, suckering suckers like this, is that you get them quickly. If the thing has a long time to grow up above the ground, it's gathering the sun's energy, it's rebuilding a root system, and guess what? You chop it off, and now it's got a root system that can resucker. So what you want to do is, as quick as possible, as you're seeing suckers, cut them off and deny them light, deny them the ability to re-energize the root system underground, and they should fade out over time. Okay. So this person, okay, so I got myself in trouble last week talking about smoking because I was just talking about my neighbor comes out and smokes over there, but we have this screen right here, but I still smell him smoking. I smoked for a long time as a young person, so I have nothing against it at all, but just, I can tell when this person's smoking. That's all I was saying, and I was trying to just point out that I can still smell it even though I have plants over here. It probably is a little bit less than I would, but it wasn't anything about anti-smoking. It was just answering a question that somebody asked about smoking. And so before I'm just saying this because this person has a chain link fence and they have 8 dogs on the other sside of it. So you know I'm not anti-dog, wasn't anti-smoker either. It's just, I'm answering questions here. They've tried, this person, they have crepe myrtles in between them, which obviously are going to go dormant during the winter time. They've tried growing Distilleum. They're in zone 8 in Fayetteville, and they were unsuccessful with Distilleum. In zone 8 in Fayetteville, you should be able to grow any holly that you want to grow, any osmanthus, loropetalum. You have a lot of leafy evergreens that you can grow in Fayetteville. Fayetteville's a little bit south of me, here in North Carolina. You can grow almost any leafy evergreen. So I would do a mix of leafy evergreens, and you can go back to the mixed border screening video that I did earlier this year. There's 13 different leafy evergreens along this border over here. You could grow every single one of them in Fayetteville. Distilleum, despite being very hardy, or despite being zone 7 to 9, tend to be a little winter sensitive early on. And so if you have them out on an open border like that, they could get some winter damage potentially initially. It's just they're super cold sensitive, especially when they're newly planted. But there's a ton of leafy evergreens that you can use to hopefully block off, having 8 dogs, barking at a fence or whatever next to you. Again, love dogs. Let's see. They were thinking about using Duke Gardens plum yew. They want to use cuttings because there's extensive roots along that section. So I guess this whole thing is shady. Okay, all day sun in the winter, but it's shady the rest of the time. So yeah, Duke Gardens plum yew would work. It's going to grow super slow, especially if you do cuttings, and then come back in with them. I might, regardless, still try to use some sort of holly, and just you'd have to do a little bit more pruning on it to keep it full in shady spaces, but. Or you could use Mahonia, like that Marvel Mahonia that was in last week's video. Camellias will work, all of which could be done from cuttings, and I have propagation videos on the channel for all of those things. I didn't realize it was shady as I was answering all that, but there are shady leafy evergreens for you as well in zone 8. Lots and lots of options. It may grow a little faster than that Duke Gardens plum yew will grow, but I do like that plant. Let's see. So I picked this question just because it says opinion on American Pillar Arborvitae as a screening plant in zone 8A, North Carolina. So American Pillar is a Thuja occidentalis, which is native to north of Pennsylvania up into Canada. I've talked about this a lot. So that's Emerald Arborvitae, DeGroote's Arborvitae, lots and lots of Thuja occidentalis. When you get down here to zone 8 in the south, they tend to have issues if you allow them to become dry. So we could walk around Raleigh right now and I could show you lots and lots of dead Thuja occidentalis that are lined up in one road right there, right next to me. There's 12 or 14 in a single line, and half of them are dead because from that 6 weeks we went without rain earlier this season. They would have needed you can't trust them to become established here in the south. So if you get a 6 or 8 week period of time without rain during the summertime, they need additional water. That's my only point. My other reason to pick this is that I've talked a lot about using mixed screens here, on the channel. And so let's say these American Pillar Arborvitae are the best thing ever. Great. But what if they aren't? And when something happens to them, you lose 15 in a row and you lose your entire screen. So my point about using a mixed screen is it doesn't have to be the perfect screening plant if you use lots of different screening plants, right? And you lose 1 or 2 in your screen, it's not going to be that big of a deal. But I've said this for a long time, is trying to just show that, hey, the more species you add along that border, the more healthy everything overall is going to be in your garden. Okay, let's see, we're on number 20. We're on 21. This person wants to transplant red twig dogwoods, Empress of China, dwarf ginkgo, and 7B. Is it too late to root prune them? No, you can go out and you absolutely root prune all these things while they're dormant. Root pruning is just going out and cutting a circle around the plant where you're eventually going to dig it out of the ground and allowing it then to stay in place for a little while before you transplant it. But you could go ahead and root prune all of those. The Empress of China dogwood, because it's evergreen, may lose a few leaves based on losing some roots down below, so keep that in mind. that's a possibility, but the ginkgo's completely asleep and the red twig dogwood's definitely asleep. Other thing is, when you move your red twig dogwoods, you'll likely get suckers where those were before. If you don't get out all the roots. But you know, you can root prune them and prepare them to move later. How do I overwinter my mandavilla that is now in the garage? The main thing is to bring it outside when you can. I think that's the biggest issue. Is we're all, again, I speak to this kind of frequently. You know, we're always looking for a solution that is the end solution for it. So, you know, how much do I water this thing? Well, I don't know. How much is it raining? How often should I, whatever? Well, not everything is a pattern like that where you can just set the pattern and that be the answer. And this is another one of those things. So how do I overwinter a mandavilla? I've had a cold snap that lasted about a week where we had lows in the 20s, and I'm about to have another one here right before Christmas. Other than that, that mandavilla could have been outside the entire time. And so that's the actual answer, is getting it back outside when you can. If you leave it in a dark garage through the whole winter, you're liable to overwater it at some point, or it's liable just to end up with, because it doesn't have enough light, to end up with some sort of insect or disease problem or whatever. But on the days it's 60 degrees, slide the thing outside into the sun and let it get some light on it. And that will, that's the biggest thing, is that you don't need to store it for the whole winter typically. You just need to store it for the days that are below freezing. Or below, like, let's say 40, so that you're not tempting fate in some way. This person is rescuing some Podocarpus gracilior from a neighbor, and I've recommended those a lot in consultations I've done with people in California. These plants are 6 to 12 foot tall. They've been staked too tightly for too long. When they remove the stake, the plant's still really weak. Should they just give up on them? Or should they just restake them? For me, I would just cut them in half. Those Podocarpus can be cut in half. And so if they're 6 to 12 foot tall, I'm gonna cut some height out of them. You probably would benefit from reducing the height a bit anyway, since you're digging them up out of the ground and moving them. And then try to get them where you can, you know, the reason that if you stake something forever and then unstake it in the future, and I've got, you know, my red bud's just going to be staked forever. There's no way to take that stake off of it. The way plants build tensile strength is by the wind moving them about, you know. And so, like at my old house, I lost 120 some trees in Hurricane Fran. Most of those trees came down because my lot had been cleared, and the trees that were there, it was a wooded neighborhood. It's called, Pleasant Woods was the name of the place. Afterwards, it was called Pleasant Stumps. But when those trees were cut away from the other trees, they had all grown up in the woods, and they had not really experienced a lot of wind. So the first time they had, you know, an 80-mile-an-hour wind up against them, they all fell like crazy. You know, they all fell or broke quickly. And it's the same thing with these. They've been sitting there so long, they haven't built that tensile strength that you would get, that plants get from bending back and forth and bending back and forth. When they grow out in the open, they tend to have, you know, like pine trees we think are dangerous. When we cut other trees away from pines, pines are kind of dangerous, but ones that grow up on their own in the middle of a front yard without any competition, are like, you couldn't blow them over with anything. You know, they may break off at the top, but they're really rigidly, you know, upright and strong. But anyway, these just have not built that tensile strength over time. So for me, I'm gonna cut them down to the point where they'll still stand up, and I'm gonna try to take them because they got pretty extensive, you know, they're certainly less expensive than buying new ones. So that's the last question from this week. Thank you guys so much who have bought the weekly garden planner or the Learn to Garden video series or t-shirts. The t-shirts are still 10% off. And again, the code's here on the screen. I doubt we would get them to you in time for Christmas at this point. But thank you guys who have ordered. We had a lot of t-shirts go out this month. Hopefully they've gotten to you in time for Christmas. And thank you guys so much for watching.